When a man is left in silence after a relationship ends, something deeply significant happens, and not in the way most people assume. It's easy to believe that if someone isn't texting or calling, they must be forgetting. But that's a naive interpretation of human psychology. Silence doesn't induce forgetting, it induces reflection. It creates a vacuum where distraction and noise once lived, and it's in that vacuum that meaning begins to crystallize. When you go no contact, you're not simply removing yourself physically, you're withdrawing your energy, your emotional investment, your presence, all the invisible scaffolding that often goes unnoticed while it's still holding everything up. People don't appreciate structure until the building starts to shake. And what often shakes a man to his core isn't your anger or your sadness after a breakup, it's your complete absence, the full stop, the nothingness. This absence becomes a mirror. And that's important to understand because human beings are, at our core, meaning-seeking creatures. We define ourselves through relationships, through our impact, through the echoes we hear after we've spoken, touched, left a room. When those echoes go silent, the questions begin. Was I wrong? Did she really move on? Did I misjudge her value? He's not asking these questions in the heat of passion. He's asking them in the quiet moments when he lies awake and there's no distraction to pacify his discomfort. The mind cannot abide unfinished stories, and your silence, your choice to stop writing in his narrative, forces him to confront the gap where your presence used to be. This is why no contact works, but only under one condition. It must be authentic. If you're pretending to be indifferent while obsessing behind the scenes, that energy still leaks through. People feel the truth even if it's unspoken. But if you've truly let go, if you've actually stepped back for your own growth and sanity, that absence becomes powerful. It's not punishment, it's a boundary. And that difference is everything. You see, a lot of men never fully process a breakup until there's no one left to blame. As long as you're reaching out, explaining yourself, reacting to him, he gets to live in the illusion that the door is still open, that you're still available, that he still has you, even without having to earn you. But when that stops, when the line goes cold, it forces him to take stock. Not just of you, but of himself, what he gave, what he took for granted, what he failed to protect. And this is where the paradox emerges. It's often in your absence that your value becomes undeniable. Not because you were trying to prove a point, but because the point was proven in how you carried yourself, in how you didn't beg, in how you didn't chase, in how you decided that your peace was worth more than proximity to someone who didn't fully see you. Men return, not always because they love you, but because they felt you. And in your silence, they began to feel the loss of you, not just the person, but the space you occupied, the emotional ground you stood on, the security you brought. And if they were unconscious of that before, the silence wakes them up. So let your absence speak louder than your words ever could. If he must miss you to realize your worth, then let him miss you. Don't fill the space he needs to sit in. Let the silence do the heavy lifting. Because here's the truth. You don't have to remind someone of your value when your absence does it for you. A second psychological driver behind why men return after no contact lies in the concept of scarcity, one of the most primal triggers of human desire. And it's not just some catchy phrase you see in dating advice columns. It's a deeply rooted evolutionary mechanism that governs how we assign value. When something is readily available, the mind registers it as common. When something becomes scarce, its perceived value multiplies exponentially, regardless of whether that value was acknowledged before. Now, this might seem transactional at first glance, as though people are merely responding to supply and demand, but it runs deeper. Scarcity doesn't create value out of thin air. It reveals value that was previously overlooked. It forces us to ask why something mattered only after it's gone. And in relationships, this dynamic plays out with unsettling clarity. When a woman removes herself after a breakup, truly removes herself with no cryptic posts, no breadcrumb texts, no lingering energy, what she's doing, consciously or not, is triggering this scarcity principle. Not in a manipulative way, but in a psychological way. She's no longer accessible. And that inaccessibility reframes her. The man who once took her attention for granted now begins to notice its absence, like an amputated limb. It's not just that she's not calling, it's that her presence, once woven into the fabric of his daily life, is now completely gone, and his mind begins to elevate what it once minimized. This is also tied to how human memory works. We are notoriously selective about what we remember. When a person is no longer in our lives, we often stop recalling the fights, the frustrations, the flaws, and instead remember how they made us feel in rare, ideal moments. Nostalgia isn't honest, it's idealized. And in the silence of no contact, that idealized version starts to replace the real one in his mind. He's not seeing the woman he left. He's remembering the version of her he didn't fully appreciate and now wishes he could have back. So many women underestimate their power in this phase. They believe that by stepping away, they're relinquishing control, but in fact, they're shifting the dynamic entirely. When you're always available, emotionally, physically, energetically, you're essentially telling someone, I'm here, regardless of how I'm treated. And that communicates low value. But when you become scarce, when you reclaim your energy and invest it in yourself instead of trying to prove your worth, you become a high value presence, not just to him, but to yourself. And that shift is magnetic. It forces a recalibration. He starts to question the choices he made. He wonders if he misjudged the depth of the connection. He reconsiders whether he left too soon or misunderstood who you really were. These aren't superficial doubts. They're existential. Because for many men, the return isn't just about wanting a person back. It's about correcting a decision that now feels like a loss. It's important to remember, though, that this only works when it's real. Scarcity that's faked, posting selfies to look happy, using silence as a strategy while secretly hoping for attention, won't trigger this shift. People are far more attuned to emotional truth than we think. True scarcity, when it stems from real detachment and self-respect, creates a gravitational pull that no amount of chasing could ever achieve. So if you're in that no contact phase and you're wondering whether it's working, stop. Don't focus on whether he's noticing. Focus on becoming the kind of woman whose presence is missed, not because she played a game, but because she embodied value and walked away when it wasn't recognized. Because when a woman learns to remove herself fully, she doesn't just become rare, she becomes unforgettable. Another deeply rooted reason men often return after a period of no contact stems from the psychological phenomenon of unresolved emotional tension. And it's important we examine this not through the lens of manipulation, but through an understanding of how human beings process emotional disruption, especially when they are emotionally underdeveloped or conflict avoidant. When a relationship ends, whether with clarity or confusion, there's often a residue of emotional energy that doesn't get fully addressed. This is especially true when a man initiates a breakup and expects clean emotional closure simply because he made a decision. The problem is human emotions don't obey intellectual decisions. Just because someone chooses to walk away doesn't mean their internal emotional system follows suit in an orderly fashion. Often it doesn't. In the immediate aftermath, there may be a sense of relief, perhaps even a temporary euphoria, a psychological release from pressure or dissatisfaction. But over time, as the brain reprocesses those moments of connection, and particularly as space allows for reflection, something deeper emerges. There's a kind of dissonance between the decision to walk away and the lingering emotional charge that wasn't resolved. This is what we call emotional incompletion. The loop was never closed. And for men especially, many of whom have been culturally conditioned to suppress introspection or avoid vulnerable confrontation, this kind of emotional loop can haunt them quietly. It doesn't announce itself, it seeps in slowly. In those quiet moments, when distractions have dulled and silence creeps in, the mind begins to ask the questions it previously avoided. Was that the right decision? Did I act prematurely? What was it in her that I was resisting, and why? Now, here's the thing. If you as a woman remain in emotional reactivity during that no contact period, if you're sending messages, trying to explain, prove, or beg for understanding, you short circuit that process. You rob him of the very silence that would have confronted him with those questions. But if you allow that space to remain, something profound happens. The internal conversation he was avoiding begins to unfold. The very tension he hoped to escape begins to resurface, demanding to be acknowledged. What men often mistake for closure in the moment is really avoidance. They walk away thinking they've tidied up the emotional mess. But real closure comes not from leaving, it comes from understanding. And when you aren't present to absorb his confusion, he's forced to wrestle with it alone. That's where the desire to return often emerges, not necessarily out of romantic longing at first, but from a need to reconcile an unresolved internal conflict. This is why so many returns after no contact don't start with a grand declaration of love. They start with a casual message. Hey, just thinking about you, or how have you been? It's a probe, a test, a way of opening the door to see if the emotional energy he left behind is still waiting for him. And it's also a way for him to soothe the unease of unfinished emotional business. Understanding this changes everything, because you, as the person on the receiving end, now recognize that his return isn't just a sign of affection, it's a psychological signal of unresolved tension. And how you respond determines whether that tension is healed or whether the cycle simply repeats. So the question becomes, are you the same person he left, or have you evolved in the silence, transmuted the pain into strength, and become someone who no longer needs that resolution from him to feel complete? That ultimately is what defines your power. Because when a woman embraces silence not as a punishment, but as a pathway to self-evolution, she doesn't wait to be chosen, she chooses herself. And from that place, whatever returns to her must meet her where she now stands, or be left in the silence it came from. There's something deeply paradoxical about the way absence shapes desire. We often think of human connection as a linear process, that the more time you spend with someone, the more you grow to care. But in reality, some of the most intense emotional realizations happen in the wake of separation. This is especially true for men who, whether through cultural messaging or personal conditioning, only come to understand the depth of their feelings when confronted with a vacuum, when what was once accessible is no longer available to them. Now, this isn't about manipulation. It's not about pulling away just to create longing. It's about understanding a psychological truth. We don't value what is constantly and unquestioningly available. We value what we might lose. We assign meaning based on scarcity, on perceived risk, on emotional consequence. And for many men, it's only after no contact begins that they begin to feel the real emotional consequences of their actions. You see, while in the relationship, or even in the aftermath, when communication still lingers, it's easy for a man to operate under a kind of emotional anesthesia. He assumes the connection is still there. He assumes the door is still open. And as long as that assumption holds, he doesn't need to truly examine the role you played in his life. But no contact changes the narrative. It introduces uncertainty, and that uncertainty forces introspection. Suddenly, there's no reassurance, no subtle check-ins, no evidence that he's still on your mind. And in the silence of that absence, something remarkable happens. He's forced to revisit his own emotional architecture. The memories don't just fade, they amplify. The moments he took for granted now surface with new weight. The things you did without needing to be asked, the energy you brought into his life, the emotional support he thought was standard. All of it begins to crystallize in retrospect. He starts to feel the impact of your presence through the sting of your absence. And it's not merely nostalgia, it's identity disruption. We often tether our sense of self to those closest to us. When that tether is cut, even temporarily, we begin to feel psychologically unmoored. If you were the one who reflected his better qualities back to him, who supported his ambitions, who brought stability or lightness or structure, then your disappearance doesn't just mark the loss of a person, it marks the loss of a version of himself he only accessed through you. That realization can be jarring. It can feel like something vital was removed from his life and he can't quite articulate what it is. This is the root of many unexpected returns. It's not just about love, it's about meaning. When you've lived in alignment with your values, when you've offered presence, consistency, and care, and then you withdraw without drama or malice, it creates an echo. That echo lingers. It bounces around in the psyche of the man who may have thought he could walk away untouched. But emotional equilibrium is never restored by forgetting someone who mattered. It's restored through reckoning. And no contact forces that reckoning. It invites the man to sit with his own behavior, his own patterns, and the weight of his choices. That process can't be rushed, and it cannot be influenced through contact. It has to emerge organically from within him. Which brings us to the deeper truth. When you become a woman of substance, when you show up in a relationship with clarity, grace, and strength, and then walk away with dignity, you don't just disappear, you become unforgettable. And when a man finally sees what he lost, not because you told him, but because he felt it, only then does he begin to understand your true value. Only then does the silence speak louder than any words ever could. So let your absence be a reflection of your self-worth, because when your presence was real, your absence becomes undeniable. There's a fundamental truth about human behavior that's often misunderstood in relationships, particularly in the aftermath of a breakup. People test boundaries not necessarily to hurt you, but to understand you. And men, whether consciously or not, often return after no contact to test one crucial thing: your emotional stability. They want to know, sometimes even need to know, whether the woman they left behind is still governed by the same emotional responses, or whether she's evolved. Now, why does this matter? Because emotional consistency is power. Emotional regulation, your ability to remain grounded in the face of uncertainty, conflict, or even temptation, is one of the clearest indicators of maturity. And after a period of no contact, when a man reaches out, he's not just seeking closure or curiosity. More often than not, he's checking to see if you've stayed the same, if he can still get a reaction, if you're still emotionally tethered to him in a way that gives him control. It's not always malicious, it's human nature. We all seek confirmation that we still matter to the people we once connected with. But what separates someone with real self-respect from someone still clinging to a false hope is how they handle that test. Because make no mistake, when he sends that casual text, when he throws out the breadcrumb, when he accidentally likes your post or asks how you've been, he's not just making conversation, he's fishing for an emotional response. And if he gets one, especially one rooted in neediness, resentment, or longing, he learns something very important. He still holds sway over your emotional world. He still has access to you without having to earn it. And that is where many women unknowingly reset the entire dynamic. They collapse the distance they created through no contact by responding in a way that's emotionally porous. Instead of standing firm in the new version of themselves that no contact helped cultivate, stronger, clearer, less reactive, they revert. Not because they're weak, but because the wound was never truly closed. It was just covered. But here's the deeper point. Emotional stability isn't about pretending you don't care. It's not about being cold or robotic or indifferent. It's about being rooted in who you are, regardless of who is in front of you. When a man returns and you are able to engage or not engage with clarity and calm without veering into emotional volatility, that sends a very powerful signal. It says, I've grown, I've faced the storm you left behind, and I didn't crumble. In fact, I rebuilt. That kind of woman doesn't just earn respect, she becomes magnetic. Not because she's playing hard to get, but because she is hard to shake. And men with depth, men who are not merely looking for ego validation, are drawn to that kind of composure. It creates contrast, it creates intrigue, and it forces them to ask questions about their own behavior, their own readiness, their own character. So when he returns after no contact and you feel that familiar urge to prove your worth, to show him you still care or to get closure, pause, breathe, ask yourself, who do I want to be in this moment? A woman reactive to the past or a woman anchored in her own self-respect? That choice, made in silence or in speech, defines the trajectory of everything that comes next. And here's the truth worth remembering. Your power doesn't come from the attention you receive. It comes from the boundaries you enforce. Let him test you. Let him see. Because the woman who remains grounded when the past comes knocking is the one who no longer lives in it, There's something deeply unsettling for a man when he senses that the woman he once walked away from no longer needs him. That subtle but profound shift from dependence to independence rattles the foundation of how he once viewed the relationship. And after a period of no contact, that transformation becomes either a threat or a mirror, often both. Now, let's be clear, men return, not always out of love or regret, but because they can feel almost instinctively that something has changed. That energetic thread of attachment has weakened. You've stopped reaching out, stopped reacting, stopped orienting your life around his choices. You've reclaimed your time, your mind, your emotional bandwidth. And that, in the male psyche, triggers an ancient mechanism tied to status, possession, and validation. And in the male psyche, triggers an ancient mechanism tied to status, possession, and see, we don't like losing access to something we thought we had control over. This isn't just male ego, it's rooted in evolutionary psychology. When a man feels he's lost his place in a woman's life and she's flourishing without him, she's not chasing, not checking, not mourning publicly, it does something that no amount of begging, pleading, or waiting ever could. It challenges his perception of himself. It questions whether he was really as irreplaceable as he once thought. And that's when the test begins. Because make no mistake, your silence isn't invisible, your detachment echoes. It sends a signal that you're no longer available in the same way. And that's what draws him back. He wants to see if it's real. If your growth was performance or transformation, he wants to know whether your silence was strategy or strength. But this is where the real work lies for you, because when he does return, there's a temptation to use that as evidence that you've won, that your patience paid off, that the no contact worked. But if your self-worth hinges on his return, then you've missed the deeper lesson entirely. No contact isn't a strategy to manipulate someone back into your life. It's a discipline to restore yourself to your life. It's the conscious removal of noise so that you can hear your own voice again, free of distortion, free of longing, free of the constant emotional chase. So when he reappears, it's not about whether he's changed, it's about whether you have. Have you clarified your values? Have you healed the wound that made you settle for less than you deserved? Have you learned to sit with discomfort without trying to fix it by attaching to someone else? Because if your solitude wasn't just empty time, but meaningful solitude, then his return won't shake you. It won't throw you off center. You'll be able to see it for what it is, a moment, not a measure of your worth. This is where your power resides, not in whether you get him back, but in whether you need to. If his return is met not with desperation, but discernment, not with fear, but firmness, then you've truly changed the narrative, not just between you and him, but within yourself. And that's the ultimate victory. When you no longer confuse someone's attention with your value. When you realize the comeback was never about them. It was about how far you had come. So if he returns, let it be confirmation not of your desirability, but of your growth. You don't need to prove anything. Your silence already did. Let that be enough. Because when your peace is no longer for sale, your presence becomes priceless.